When Mad Men begins, Roger is a character for whom it's difficult to have any sort of significant sympathy. The word privileged is used a lot these days, perhaps too much, but I can't think of a character who better fits that label than Roger. His distinction among all the characters of Mad Men arises largely from how he was basically handed his position by his father. Roger did not necessarily want to be in advertising, he simply did not have a choice. Now, this does not necessarily mean that he didn't want to be in advertising, but rather it's just to say that not being in advertising was never really an option for him. He didn't arrive at Sterling Cooper after a long and drawn-out period of consideration and soul-searching, determining which path he will take in life. He arrived at Sterling Cooper because his father, the Sterling whose name is on the agency, the Sterling who founded the company 3 decades ago with Bert Cooper, that Sterling raised him to be his successor. His path thus differs noticeably from Pete, the Mad Men character to whom he is most often compared. Pete also hails from a wealthy, pseudo-aristocratic family. Indeed, he comes from one of the most prestigious families in New York. If you're ever in Manhattan, which I highly recommend, it is a beautiful island and the beating heart of America. If you're ever in Manhattan, I really recommend that you go up to the north side of the island and you'll find a place called Dyckman Street. It's named for the illustrious Dyckman family, who owned the entire north part of Manhattan back when New York was a Dutch colony back in the 17th century. Pete is related to those Dyckmans. He's as blue blood as it gets. Still, it's not like his life is entirely easy and simple. There are a lot of complications. His family has gone broke because of poor monetary decisions. Like a lot of aristocratic and pseudo-aristocratic families on both sides of the Atlantic by the 20th century, Pete's family has a lot of prestige, but not a lot of wealth to match it. It also does not help Pete that his prestigious family looks down on him for going into advertising, which might not seem like a particularly egregious profession for you or me, but as showrunner Matthew Weiner described it, back then, to people from those prestigious backgrounds, it was the equivalent of someone going into acting. Even if you make a lot of money and find a lot of success, there's something very gauche about being in such a public-facing profession. But Pete perseveres nonetheless. He wants to make it. He has talent and ambition and drive, which Roger does not. He has a desire to prove himself, which Roger doesn't have. The key differences between them become quite evident in the second half of the series when a conflict erupts between them, when Roger, fearing his obsolescence, tries to leech off Pete's accomplishments, causing Pete quite a bit of annoyance. Even at the start of Mad Men, Pete knows exactly who he wants to be. Specifically, he wants to be Don Draper, which is not exactly the most advisable goal in the world, considering that no one can be Don Draper, not even Don Draper. Don Draper is not a person so much as an image of wealth and success according to the mid-century standards of America. Nonetheless, while this pursuit might be unhealthy, at least Pete has aspirations, while Roger has none. At the beginning, we might feel envy and jealousy toward Roger, and quite a bit of bitterness along with that. He is the scion of fortune and success, the symbol and emblem of excess and glamour. Indeed, even when he feels discontent, it's hard to completely sympathize with his discontent, considering that he is extremely well off, not only by our standards, but also even by the standards of the show. While Dawn appears to be the epitome of this old school American masculine businessman, that's something of an act. His relationships with the women in his life, American capitalism, and even the image other people have of him as a person are much more tenuous than Dawn would ever like to admit. Roger doesn't have to act. He doesn't have to put on this madman pizzazz. It's just naturally who he is. That is his blessing, and that is also his curse. As the great TV critic Matt Zoller-Seist has noted, Mad Men is a resolutely non-dogmatic, non-ideological show. But if it does have an underlying philosophy, I'd argue that's a sort of Sartrin existentialism, with its skepticism toward the idea of a wholly unified self. The world and the interactions in it between people being so strange and isolating and convoluted that it's hard to say that a person has specific traits because of specific factors in their upbringing. Even though it's not like their upbringing is entirely irrelevant either. And also, and this is really the key point here, Mad Men reflects Sartre's view that we shape our beings, our very senses of self, through the actions we take. Existence does not precede essence. There is not this abstract thing called ourselves that leads to us taking actions. Rather, we are entirely free to make our actions. We might be influenced by the people we were or by outside forces, but our actions are purely free for us to determine. And in determining those actions, we choose who we want to be. This matters in this framework because acting is how we define our true selves. And I don't mean acting in terms of engaging in bad faith, accepting roles about ourselves that do not match the fundamental truth that we are free beings, liberated to make our own fates. But rather, I mean acting in the sense that we are all free individuals who have the capacity to determine ourselves, our very senses of being. The two kinds of acting are not entirely unrelated, Mad Men argues, and there's a lot of both kinds of acting on the show. Dawn gets bogged down, perhaps too much, in the former kind of acting, the playing a false role kind of acting. But even he, through playing that role, forges eventually a version of himself that is not either Dick Whitman, the person he was before he adopted the Draper identity, or the Draper identity itself. He's a third person now, and he has to figure out who that is. Characters like Peggy and Pete, they also have to make these choices to determine their identities, to determine who they actually are. As a result of doing this, they become more aware and more capable individuals. Roger does not have to do this, and so he doesn't, and so he's left behind. At least starting with his heart attack that takes place near the end of Season 1, he is a man aware of his own incoming obsolescence. He is actually not that much older than Dawn, but the difference between how they act is noticeable. I saw one review that compared it to the Nixon versus Kennedy debates that formed such a big plot line in Season 1. Nixon was not actually that much older than JFK, but JFK radiated youth. He radiated this image of a new America, whereas Nixon looked very old in comparison, and so it is with Dawn and Roger. Already, Roger is looking back on his life with disappointment and regret that he has not done as much as he had really hoped he would. There's this wonderful scene where he talks about how he's always clung to this image of himself as a person who built a business, but he didn't. His father did. He just inherited it. He has not really built anything. What is the significance of his life? There doesn't seem to be much to it. The show gets at this in a really clever way when he's writing his memoirs in Season 4. Now, again, Roger is not that much older than Dawn. He's a bit young to already be writing his memoirs. But that's something that says a lot about who he is as a person. And it says a lot about his doubts that he can't even sell these memoirs. No one wants to buy them. No one thinks they have value. This is the result of his life, all his work, and it turns out to be a lot less than he thought it was. Think about how in Season 4 he loses Lucky Strike, by far the company's largest account, and this nearly causes the company to go under by the end of Season 4. What is his role in this modern world? Whenever the company suffers some sort of buyout, such as what happens with PPL in Season 3, or when McCann finally buys Sterling Cooper near the end of the series, no one knows what to do with Roger. The buying company looks over the payroll and what everyone's duties are, and they don't seem to get what Roger offers. That they don't seem to think that he really benefits the services this company offers to its clients, and this perception of Roger as completely obsolete would hurt Roger a lot less if it was completely unfounded. He knows there is at least a grain of truth in what they're saying, even though he doesn't want to admit it. Unlike the fan-favorite Cooper, who goes out with his own glamorous dance sequence, Roger doesn't know what to do with himself. He's not satisfied with the life he's had. It's not a full life in his mind. He's not satisfied with simply riding into the autumnal sunset, so he must decide what the next stage of his life is going to be. And despite the central tragedy at the heart of his character, the show demonstrates him making a bit of progress toward that next stage, toward that sense of resolution. In one of the last episodes of the show, we see him with Peggy. They're the only two people left in the old Sterling Cooper Draper Price building. And the two of them have never had the warmest relationship. He's never had that intimate, very personal connection with Peggy that Dawn has. But the icy tension between them thaws, and he manages to give her some genuinely good advice. Even though the world has perhaps changed for the worse for people like him, it's changed for the better for Peggy, and he's genuinely hopeful for her. And after 2 failed marriages and a string of ill-conceived affairs, he finally enters into a relationship with Marie, Megan's mother. A very strange resolution to the whole Megan region of the show, but it's a fitting one. It demonstrates how Roger has finally come to terms with who he is. He is not a young man anymore, and he's decided to stop vainly chasing youth. He's finally accepted who he is in this world, instead of trying to just close his eyes and throw his head in the sand, and there is something respectable about that, even though his age is indeed over by the end of Mad Men. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. I realize this is a bit different from the kinds of videos I've been making recently, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless if you are one of my regular viewers. I recommend watching Mad Men, or if you're younger, perhaps recommending it to your parents. It's a very subtle, thoughtful, philosophical show. Not the most exciting thing in the world, but genuinely one of the most nuanced pieces of art of the last 20 years or so. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you all that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.